Sheriff slaps black boy at school assembly. Then the U.S. Secretary of Defense walks in clapping. The auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents, teachers, and students packed the rows of metal folding chairs, their eyes fixed on the stage adorned with red, white, and blue streamers. It was awards day at Harrison County High School, a proud annual event in this quiet southern town where football reigned and reputations lived long. A brass band stood ready in the corner. The principal, a balding man with a stiff smile, adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. Today, he began, we honor the brightest and best of our school, those who represent the future of Harrison County and this great nation. Scattered applause rose, and Elijah stood in the wings, fingers gripping the speech in his hand. He adjusted his collar, second-hand but clean, and looked out at the sea of unfamiliar faces. He'd worked hard for this. Straight A's, science fair winner, MVP in track, community service leader. He wasn't supposed to be here, but he was, and he was going to speak. His mother watched from the back, wiping her hands nervously on her janitor's uniform. She didn't sit with the other parents. She didn't need to. Her son was going to walk onto that stage and show them all. Elijah Jones, our Student Excellence honoree, will now share a few words, the principal announced. Elijah stepped forward, a few polite claps. He took a breath, and then it happened. A shadow moved fast from the side of the stage. Sheriff Don Jenkins, towering in his tan uniform, belt heavy with a gun and radio, strode toward Elijah with a scowl on his leathery face. Hold it right there, he barked. The auditorium quieted. Elijah stopped, confused. Sir? The sheriff's hand cracked across his face. A gasp sucked the air out of the room. Elijah stumbled but didn't fall. He looked up, the side of his cheek burning red, but his back still straight. That's for your tone, the sheriff growled. You people need to learn some respect. Dead silence. No teacher moved. The principal looked at the floor. A few parents shifted uncomfortably. A woman took out her phone but put it away quickly. Elijah stood still, jaw clenched. The speech crumpled slightly in his hand. No tears, no fear. From the back of the auditorium came the slow, deliberate sound of clapping. Clap, clap, clap. People turned, murmuring. A tall man in a dark military uniform walked through the aisle, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the stunned silence. His chest gleamed with medals. His face was calm but unreadable. He kept clapping as he approached the stage, eyes locked on Elijah, unbothered by the sheriff, unbothered by the silence. He stepped onto the stage beside the boy. Well, he said, still clapping, that was one hell of a stand. Elijah didn't move at first. The sound of the clapping still echoed in his ears. But now it was joined by murmurs, ripples of recognition passing through the crowd like a current. Someone whispered a name, then another. A teacher rose slowly to her feet. A few students followed. The man in uniform lowered his hands and turned toward the sheriff. Is this how you treat young leaders in this town? His voice wasn't raised, but it held steel. Sheriff Jenkins hesitated, clearly recognizing the man now but unsure of how to play it. Just keeping order, sir. The boy was being disrespectful. The man's eyes narrowed. Disrespectful? For walking up to a podium at an assembly he was invited to speak at? He turned to Elijah. Are you okay, son? Elijah nodded slightly, though the heat in his cheek hadn't faded. Yes, sir. The man smiled, not with pity, but with pride. That's what I thought. He turned back to the crowd and raised his voice just enough to carry. Some of you may not know me. My name is David Langston. I serve as the United States Secretary of Defense. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even the band members, who had been slouching in their chairs, sat up straight. Phones were now out, filming. Secretary Langston continued. I was invited here today under a different arrangement. I came quietly. I wanted to see a certain young man deliver his speech. I didn't want the attention on me. But now, the attention's here, and I intend to use it. He gestured to Elijah. This young man represents the best of this country: resilience, discipline, and intelligence. He grew up in circumstances many of you will never understand. No father, a working mother who cleans this very building every night so you can sit in these clean seats. And yet he's here, not just surviving, but rising. He turned to the sheriff again. And you, sir, slapped him for that. The room was frozen. Elijah stood beside Secretary Langston. uncertain what to do, but the man gently put a hand on his shoulder. "Elijah," he said softly, "would you still like to give your speech?" Elijah looked around. The faces that once looked away now stared with wide, unblinking eyes. His mother had tears in hers, a hand over her mouth. "Yes," he said quietly, "I would." Langston stepped back, and Elijah walked to the microphone. His voice was steady, but carried weight. "When I was 8 years old," Elijah began, "a teacher told me I would probably end up in prison. She said boys like me don't become leaders. They either disappear, get locked up, or get shot." He paused, and for a while, I believed her. His eyes scanned the crowd. "But someone else told me something different. That the world doesn't belong to those who speak the loudest, but to those who speak the truth." He held up the crumpled paper in his hand and let it fall to the floor. "I don't need this anymore. Because what I need to say can't be read. It has to be felt." And then he spoke. About injustice. About silence. About the kind of hurt that doesn't show up in bruises, but lives in the quiet moments when no one speaks up. About growing up poor, being followed in stores, being underestimated, ignored, spoken over. About being told to sit down, when all he ever wanted was to stand. His voice never wavered. By the time he finished, the auditorium was on its feet. Even the principal was clapping now. Though he looked ashamed, the sheriff had backed off the stage and stood near the exit, sweating under the harsh stage lights. Secretary Langston took the microphone once more. "There will be consequences for what happened here today. Not just because of who I am, but because of who this young man is. And because of what he represents." He turned to Elijah. "Would you walk with me, son?" Together, they walked down the steps of the stage, side by side, as cameras flashed and the audience parted before them. Elijah's mother ran forward and wrapped her arms around him. Secretary Langston looked over at her and smiled. "You raised a lion, ma'am." She nodded, tears still streaming. "I just tried to raise a man." The auditorium remained tense, even after Elijah's powerful words. A strange paralysis hung over the crowd. People were standing, yes, but their applause was scattered and unsure. Like they didn't know what to do now that the moment demanded something more than just clapping. There were no chants. No one stepped forward. The room was full, but Elijah had never felt so alone under the lights. He turned from the Secretary of Defense and faced the microphone again. His voice low but clear. "Thank you," Elijah said slowly, "for reminding me that silence can be louder than violence." The words pierced the stillness like a blade. Some gasped quietly. Others held their breath. The sheriff, who had now moved to the edge of the stage, flinched as if struck by the line. "You didn't just slap me," Elijah continued. "You reminded this entire room of something we try to forget. That power unchecked becomes permission. And silence is permission." He looked at the front row, at the principal, at the teachers who had taught him, tested him, corrected him, praised his writing, then said nothing when he was struck. The principal still wouldn't meet his eyes. "I grew up on the east side of town," Elijah said, letting the weight of the words settle, "where buses don't come on time, and textbooks are older than the students. My mom works nights cleaning up after people who won't speak to her in daylight. And every morning, I looked in the mirror and asked myself if I'd make it out. Now," he looked up, "but I studied anyway. I ran track like I was running out of this place. I helped build a tutoring program for kids who look like me. I came here today to give a speech on leadership." He paused. "Now I see I'm giving a different one." A few hands clapped, hesitantly at first. One student, then two, then a father in the back nodded, and began clapping louder. Slowly, a wave of applause began to build again. It was stronger now, less polite. Some students stood, fists by their sides or over their hearts. But the sheriff was watching it all, and his face was turning redder by the second. "That's enough," Sheriff Jenkins barked, stepping forward and pointing a thick finger at Elijah. "This isn't your platform, boy." The microphone squealed as Elijah stepped back. But he didn't leave. "I said enough," the sheriff shouted again, and turned toward two uniformed deputies near the side doors. "Get him out of here. Now, this little punk's done." The two deputies hesitated, clearly unsure. All eyes swung toward them. Tension snapped through the crowd like a live wire. "You heard me," Jenkins growled. "Toss the kid out before I have him arrested for disorderly conduct." A murmur swept through the room. Phones were filming now, dozens of them. Some hands trembled as they held their cameras. Some faces turned away, unsure whether this was bravery or danger. Elijah stood still, chest rising, eyes unflinching, and then a voice rang out from the back of the room. "Try it, Don, I dare you." It wasn't loud, but it cut through the auditorium like a bullet. Heads turned, the sheriff froze, and there, standing in the aisle near the last row of seats, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a black suit. He wore no medals, but his presence filled the space like a sudden storm. His skin was dark, his posture military. He walked forward slowly, hands behind his back, eyes locked on Jenkins. "Colonel Benjamin Rivers," Secretary Langston said with recognition and a hint of relief. "Didn't expect you here today." "Neither did I," Colonel Rivers replied without taking his eyes off the sheriff. "But then someone told me what happened, and I figured this town might need a witness." The sheriff's voice caught in his throat. "Ben, this is none of your. Don't call me Ben. And yes, it is my business." Rivers reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a document. He handed it to one of the deputies. "This is an order from the Office of the Inspector General. Effective immediately. Sheriff Donald Jenkins is suspended pending investigation for civil rights violations and abuse of authority." Gasps erupted from the crowd. The sheriff turned pale. "You're bluffing," he snarled. "You can't come into my county and—" "Actually, I can," Colonel Rivers interrupted, "and so can the Secretary of Defense, and the Department of Justice, and the national media, which, by the way, will be very interested in the footage taken by over 40 people in this room." The deputies looked at each other. The younger one, no older than 25, stepped toward the sheriff. "Sir, maybe you should stand down." Jenkins glared at him, but the heat had drained from his anger. The storm he'd started had grown beyond his reach. He looked at Elijah, still standing, still calm, still waiting for someone to flinch. "Y'all don't understand," Jenkins muttered. "This ain't about race. It's about discipline. Order." "No," Colonel Rivers said. "This is about fear. And you're afraid of the kind of order that rises from justice." Jenkins took a final step back and turned away. The crowd parted again, but this time not for honor, for retreat. Colonel Rivers stepped up to the stage, stood next to Elijah, and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just give a speech today," Rivers said. "You issued a challenge, and every person in this room has to decide if they'll accept it." Elijah nodded, breathing steady. The Secretary of Defense moved forward again, face unreadable but proud. "Let history note this day, not for the slap, but for the voice that answered it." Now the room erupted in real applause. Not cautious, not delayed, real. Students hugged their parents. Teachers wept silently. Even the principal stepped forward, wiping his glasses. Elijah's mother walked up onto the stage and took her son's hand. The crowd cheered louder. And in that moment, against all odds, against the weight of silence, a black boy who had been struck on a stage stood taller than any flag in the room. The auditorium had just begun to settle into a stunned silence when a second wave of footsteps echoed down the center aisle. Slow, heavy, intentional. A tall man was walking toward the stage, dressed in a pristine, dark green military uniform. His chest bore rows of medals, bronze, silver, ribbons that meant years of service, sacrifice, valor. Every detail of his appearance was immaculate, from the perfect crease in his pants to the polished tips of his boots. But it wasn't the uniform that commanded the room. It was the way he moved, the way the air seemed to adjust itself around him. He clapped as he walked, slow and rhythmic. Clap, clap, clap. Elijah turned to look, his breath caught. The room turned too, and recognition rippled outward like a wave. Whispers rose again, this time filled with awe, not confusion. The man stepped up onto the stage and met Elijah's eyes with calm warmth. "Well done," he said, his deep voice carrying through the auditorium with commanding clarity. "That was not just a speech. That was courage." The man turned to face the crowd, letting a beat of silence stretch. "My name is Douglas L. Matthews," he said, pausing long enough for the name to settle in. A gasp broke out from the front row. "The Secretary of Defense," someone whispered. "Of the United States," someone else echoed. Now the crowd erupted in full. Students, parents, faculty. Phones shook in trembling hands. Even the television crew from the local news station shoved past each other to get a clear shot. The principal nearly fell over his own feet as he stood abruptly. brushing invisible dust from his jacket. The sheriff, still lingering by the door, went pale as limestone. Secretary Matthews lifted a hand, and the room fell quiet again. "I wasn't supposed to speak today," he said. "Originally, I asked to stay off the program. I didn't want the event to be about me. But when I heard what happened from Colonel Rivers, I realized it couldn't not be about me anymore." He turned and looked at Elijah, his gaze steady. "Because I've been exactly where this young man is standing." He paused, and for a moment, it was like the auditorium bent in closer to hear him. "I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana," he began. "Single mother, 2 jobs, small apartment, thin walls. I walked 5 miles to school and got stopped by the police 3 times in 1 week. I got told by a guidance counselor that the military was probably the only path for someone like me. If you don't end up in jail first," she said. A murmur rose again, softer this time, outrage. "Yes, but also sorrow. But I went into the army," Matthews continued, "and not because I had no other choice. I chose it because I believed in something bigger. I believed in serving a nation that didn't yet fully see me, but one I could help shape." He let those words land, then pointed gently toward Elijah. "This young man reminds me of myself. The grit, the poise, the clarity of thought under pressure, the bravery to speak when no one else would. Today, he did more to uphold the values of this nation than most people will in a lifetime." There was silence again, but now, it wasn't hollow. It was reverent. Matthews turned his attention toward the sheriff, who tried to step backward, but the eyes of the room had already turned with him. Sheriff Jenkins cleared his throat. "Look, this isn't what it looks like." The boy was being disruptive. "I was just trying to protect the decorum of the event. You slapped a child." Matthews cut in, his voice now devoid of warmth. "On stage, in front of hundreds of witnesses. And now you're scrambling to protect yourself. Not the truth. I've served this country long enough to know that real strength never strikes down, it lifts up. What you did today was cowardice." The sheriff opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Secretary Matthews nodded once toward Colonel Rivers, who stepped forward and handed him a folder. Matthews opened it. "I'm officially launching a joint investigation into misconduct within the county's law enforcement and school disciplinary systems," Matthews announced. Effective immediately. Murmurs turned to shouts of support. Some parents clapped, some students cried. "And this young man," Matthews continued, turning back to Elijah, "will not be silenced again." He looked toward the news crews, the school administrators, the audience. "Later this week, Elijah will join me in Washington, D.C., to share his story. Not just in this auditorium, but before the nation. We will hold a televised roundtable on youth leadership, systemic injustice, and the future of education in this country. He will be one of the key voices at the table." Elijah blinked. His legs wobbled slightly, and his mother moved instinctively toward him, grabbing his hand. I don't know what to say," Elijah whispered. Matthews smiled and leaned in. "You've already said it. You just need to say it again, louder this time." Then, turning to the audience, he added, "And for those of you wondering whether this is too much attention for one student, remember, Elijah didn't ask for the spotlight. He earned it. The difference between a troublemaker and a trailblazer is not in the noise they make, but in what they stand for when the room turns against them." The room thundered with applause. Not hesitant now, but thunderous. Unified. Righteous. Sheriff Jenkins turned and quietly slipped out the side door, unnoticed except by a few. No one followed. Instead, all eyes were on the boy on stage. The boy with the red cheek, the clear voice, and the courage to stand. The school principal stepped forward and offered his hand to Elijah. His voice cracked. "I was wrong," he said simply. Elijah hesitated, then shook his hand. Later that afternoon, as Elijah stood on the school steps beside Secretary Matthews and Colonel Rivers, with national reporters gathering and microphones pointed in every direction, one question rang out from a CNN journalist. "Elijah, what would you say to other students who feel voiceless right now?" Elijah looked directly into the camera. "I'd say your voice is always there," he said, "even if they try to mute it, even if they call it trouble. Speak anyway, stand anyway, because your silence will never protect you, but your truth just might change everything." The feed went live, the world watched, and a boy once struck down on stage had just stood up for millions. The video reached 1 million views in less than 24 hours. By the end of the week, it had become one of the most shared pieces of footage in the country. Not just because it was shocking, a sheriff slapping a child on stage during a school assembly, but because of what followed. The calm defiance, the speech, the thunderous applause, and the moment the Secretary of Defense walked through those auditorium doors. Clapping. News anchors ran special features. Editorials titled, "The Elijah Effect," filled the pages of national papers. Civil rights leaders called it a cultural tipping point. Students across the country began organizing similar, silent stands, peaceful demonstrations where they'd rise in assemblies. Say Elijah's now iconic line, "And sit back down. Thank you for reminding me that silence can be louder than violence." Elijah became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of clarity, of the power of one clear voice. Unmoved by fear, scholarship offers poured in, from Ivy League universities and private institutions he'd never even heard of. Letters arrived at his house from veterans, professors, mothers, teenagers. Some were typed, most were handwritten. One from a boy in Wyoming read, "I didn't think anyone would ever speak for kids like us. But you did, so now I will too." His mother, Angela, was invited to speak at several parenting forums and civil rights panels. One national magazine featured her with the headline, "The Woman Who Raised a Generation's Voice." At first, she resisted the attention. "I'm just a mom," she would say. "I didn't do anything special." But when asked how she raised a boy like Elijah, her answer became just as memorable as his speech. "I listened, even when he didn't say anything. Especially then." Meanwhile, the school board faced an emergency review. The principal stepped down. Half the school's leadership was asked to resign or undergo mandatory anti-bias training. Policies were rewritten from the ground up, with input from student representatives, including Elijah. The sheriff was suspended, then later resigned after an official investigation. But even more than that, the sheriff's actions had lit a fire that couldn't be put out. Across the nation, school districts began revisiting how authority was wielded in school spaces. New legislation was introduced to ban law enforcement from using physical force against minors in non-life-threatening situations. Lawmakers even named it the Elijah Initiative, in honor of the boy who stood tall when the system tried to shrink him. Despite the whirlwind, Elijah remained humble. He still washed dishes after dinner, still walked his neighbor's dog on Saturdays, still said, "Yes, ma'am," and "Yes, sir." But something had changed, not around him, within him. One night, a week after the event, Elijah sat by his bedroom window, the house silent except for the soft hum of cicadas outside. In his hands was a small envelope, faded, soft at the edges. It was the same letter he had received months ago, from a distant uncle. The return address missing. It had come during a particularly difficult time, after he was suspended for talking back, when a teacher mispronounced his name for the 6th time in a week. He hadn't known who sent it, only that the words inside had somehow hit the center of his chest and stayed there. He unfolded the letter now, and read it again. Blank, underscore, blank. Dear Elijah, you don't know me, but I know kids like you. Sharp mind, big heart, carried by a name that too many people hear as a threat before they hear it as a person. Let me say this plainly. You are not trouble. You are a mirror, and people don't always like what they see in a mirror, especially when it shows them their own fear, their own bias, their own history. But hold steady. Speak when it matters. Listen even more. And if the world tries to tell you that you're too young, too loud, too different, remember this. Movements don't start with famous people. They start with invisible kids who decide to be visible. You're not invisible. You never were. Signed, a man who once believed he was just a boy. Blank, underscore, blank. Elijah smiled to himself. He knew now who had written it. Not just the Secretary of Defense. Not just a powerful man in uniform. But someone who remembered. Someone who hadn't forgotten what it meant to feel unseen. He folded the letter, tucked it back into its envelope, and whispered into the night, "Thank you." The next day, Elijah was invited to speak at the opening session of a National Youth Summit in Washington, D.C. As he stepped onto the stage, wearing a simple suit, no tie, he didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't aim to be profound. He just told the truth. When I stood on that stage at my school, he began, I wasn't trying to be a hero. I wasn't even trying to fight. I just wanted people to listen. And what I've learned since then is this." He paused. The room leaned in. "Your voice matters. Even when it shakes. Even when you think no one cares. Don't wait to be invited to speak. Don't wait to be older or smarter or more important. The world isn't waiting for perfect voices. It's waiting for honest ones." He looked at the sea of faces, black, brown, white, young, old, some crying, some clapping, some just frozen in attention. "Don't ever think you're just a kid with nothing to say," Elijah said, his voice firm now. "Maybe the world has been waiting for you to say it." There was silence. Then the applause came, not for what he had been through, but for what he had chosen to do with it. Elijah stepped down from the stage. The light followed him, and in its glow, others began to rise, one by one, a new generation, standing tall. The end. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter. Thank you, and never be afraid to speak your truth.